In this episode, we're going to talk about functions. We're going to describe what functions are, we're going to talk about how to create them, and we're going to talk about the different return types that we have in C++. Without wasting any time, let's start coding. So when we talk about functions, right, we need to be aware of separation of concept, right? So it essentially means when we separate a program into smaller parts, with each part performing a certain operation, right? So that's essentially what we want to do, right? We want to take a bigger program, right, and separate it into smaller parts, right, that are essentially manageable, right? So that is what a function does for us, right? So it allows us to containerize a sequence of instructions on a statement, right? So we can just take a certain portion that is related, right, and put it in one in one function, right? We're going to discuss the different types of the different return types of the function, right? I believe we briefly touched on this in episode 1, right? When we discussed about the integer, right? The integer return for the main function, right? So most of these functions that we're going to be creating are going to be returning something, right? We discussed these different data types, right? So we can expect an integer being returned, right? A double being returned, a char being returned, or a string being returned. The one that is new is what we call a void, right? So a void function is one that does not return anything whatsoever, right? It's usually used to just display, right? And then we talk about parameters of a function, right? We say parameters of a function are essentially the inputs of a function, right? And then we're going to talk about the default values, right? So default values, how they work, essentially safeguards for when we don't pass in the parameter that we set up, right? We'll see how we actually set it up and explain it as we go along. So let's just get straight and write our first function. So suppose we were tasked with building a program that prompts a user for two numbers, and then we display the sum of those two numbers, right? So how do we go about doing that, right? So what I want to do is stick to adding two integers for now, right? So we don't make it too complex, right? So I'm going to create a function, and the solo task of this function is to prompt the user for a number, store the number, and return it, right? We're going to talk about return in a second, right? But we're prompting the user for a number, and then we want to return, right? What type of number are we returning? Or rather, what data type of return is an integer? Because I told you for now we're only working with integers, right? The sum of integers, right? So we're going to create a variable called number. We're going to prompt the user to enter a number. Right. So once they enter the number, we want to read that number and store it in our variable number, right? So once that's done, we're going to return the number, right? So let us just discuss what we just did, right? Before we get to the statement, right? So have we broken any rule so far? No, we haven't broken any rule. This is something we are used to, right? We create a variable called integer, right? We prompt the user for a value. We read whatever value they have entered into the number, right? Into our variable, right? Which is essentially called number, right? Now we are returning, right? What are we returning and where are we returning? We're returning the value of the variable, right? Or the variable itself, right? To where? We don't know as of yet, right? We just want to double check something before we can do that, right? Let us double check something. So this function is telling us we're going to return an integer, right? Are we indeed returning an integer? Let us double check that. Yes, the variable that we are returning, number, is indeed an integer. We can see that it is an integer. So what we are returning is an integer. So we haven't broken any rule with this function, right? So let us go ahead and discuss where we are returning, right? So suppose we call the function get number, right? Because, and I think that's another thing I forgot to mention, right? The only function that does not need you to call it is the main function, right? It automatically calls, right? The rest of the functions need you to call them, right? Need you to call it. So what happens when we call this function? A new variable is going to be created. We're going to prompt the user for a number. What we're going to do with the number, we're going to store it in a variable, and then we're going to return that variable, right? So where are we returning it? The number gets returned where, or rather, whatever is being returned, the variable that's being returned, is returned where the function is called, right? Where the function is called. So this call right here is returning something, which is a number, right? So we need to store whatever value is being returned here into a variable, right? Into something that we can use, right? So we can go ahead and say, we can store it in the variable a, right? So I hope that that part makes sense, right? So remember, the whole goal was to add two numbers, right? So we need another variable b, right? And this is where we see one of the benefits of a function. We do not have to write a whole new function or some block of code to add to get a number, right? What we can do is call this the very same function, right? Because remember, like I discussed earlier, right? Whenever this function is called, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new variable. It's going to prompt the user for a number, right? It's going to read that number and then return it, right? So whatever number is going to be returned here, we store it in the variable b. Right? So we have done the first task, which is to get the two numbers, right? The second task that we want to do is add the two numbers. So what we want to do is create a function called add, right? This is where we introduce parameters, right? So it's going to take input, right? It's going to take, that's what the reason why I said let's stick to integers for now. Let's just make it simple for ourselves, right? Is expecting two integers. You can call it, we're going to call it a and integer b, right? And then what we do is we want to return the sum of the two integers, right? So you can say a and plus b, right? So essentially what have we done, right? We have created a function, right? This function takes in two parameters, right? Or two inputs, right? An integer a and integer b, right? What is it returning? It is returning a plus b. Where is it returning? Where it is called. And I think it's very important that we remember that, where it is called. So as of now, this function has not been called yet, right? So there's nothing that's really being returned, right? So let us look at this, right? So now we have the value of a, we have the value of b, and we want the sum of the two. What we want to do is call the function add that we created ourselves, right? And then passing the two values. We want to pass in a and we want to pass in b, right? And then when these values are passed in, right, it can be maybe 10 and 5, right? What it's going to do is it's going to say a, right? A, that is return, you see, a plus b, right, which is passed in, right, is going to return the sum of the two, right? So something is being returned here, right? Something is being returned. Before we can check what that something is being returned, let's just check if we have broken any rules, right? So this function is promising to return something, a certain data type, which is an integer, right? So we need to make sure that what we are returning is indeed an integer. A plus b, is it an integer? Yes, it is. Why? Because the sum of an integer, an integer and an integer adding up, we're always going to get an integer, right? That is why what we return is indeed an integer. So no rule was broken there, right? So let's get back to what is being returned. So we know that a value is being returned, right? So in a case whereby the user entered 5 the first time and then 2 the second time, right? We know that the result, we know that logically we're supposed to get 7, right? So when we pass in 5 here and we pass in 2 here, we are expecting the value that is returned to be 7, right? So we need to store whatever is being returned in a variable, right? We need to store whatever is being returned in a variable, right? So once that's stored in a variable, what we want to do is display, right? Very important, display. That's the only thing what we want to do. So remember the keyword that I told you about, void, right? So we can say void display, maybe you can call it sum, whatever you want, you feel comfortable with, right? Right. So this function is not going to return anything. Instead, it's just going to display, right? But it's going to have an input. And yes, this is very much possible. You can still have an input even if you're not returning anything. It's going to have an input. That input is going to be an integer, right? It's going to be an integer value, right? So in this case, we're just going to call it in sum, so we don't confuse ourselves. Whatever we're passing in is whatever whatever we're receiving is what we're passing in, right? So what is this function going to do? It's going to display the sum of two numbers, right? Right. So you see, in this case, we do not have to return anything. We're just going to display, right? So what we need to do is call the function display, right? So once we call the function display, we need to remember that the function display is also expecting a variable, right? It's expecting a parameter, right? So that is where we pass in sum, right? The sum that we received here, right? Way after adding the two, right? And then we're going to display. Because this is not returning anything, we do not have to store anything in any variable. And that is the code that is necessary to prompt the user for two numbers, right? And then, prompt the user for two numbers, sum them up, and display the sum, right? So let's just go ahead and compile this and see the expected result. Right, now that it's compiled successfully, we can go ahead and run the program. Right, so remember it prompts us firstly to enter a number. We're going to say 5, just like we said in the example, 5. And you can see it prompts us to enter a second number. We're going to say 2, and we see that it displayed the value of the sum of the two, which is 7, right? So essentially the program is working the way we want it to work, right? All right, so we have seen how we can separate different actions or instructions into different components, which we call functions, right? And then let them essentially perform that specific task, right? So what I want to clarify is that this does not only work with integers, right? So this can work with any other data types, right? More specifically, the string, the char, the double float, right? So if, for instance, if we wanted to get the name of someone, right, of a user, we could create a function called name, right, and then we would essentially just prompt. I'm just going to copy this, right, would prompt them, right, but along the way what we need to be aware of, right, is the return type, our return type, right? So this is very important. We always need to check this whenever we do something like this, right? So with Visual Studio Code, we can already see that it's essentially telling us that this is not going to work, right? This is very hard to interpret, right? But I think some things we just need to be able to take them step by step and understanding what we're retaining, right? So the function is promising to return a string, right? And then, but the variable that we're returning is an integer. We can already see that we're breaking the rules, right? So we can easily just change this function into a string, name it maybe name, right? So that it's appropriate to what we're doing, right? Right, and then return name, right? Just going to go ahead and just change everything, right? And this would work, right? Because we're returning a variable that's a string, just like we promised in a string, right? And it will be the same thing when we call, right? It will return the name where it is called, right? So that's essentially it, right? So even with the addition of numbers, right? Suppose maybe we were expecting a double, right? So what we need to do is just change everything to a double. So the idea is just to be consistent with it, right? So what we're expecting is what we're supposed to also return, right? So that's essentially it with separation of concern, right? All right, so I wanted to go ahead and discuss default values of a function, right? These are essentially parameters that are already set with values in case no value is passed into them, right? So I think it's best to show you what I'm talking about than to actually explain it, right? So let us create a function that is going to display information, right? Strictly just display, right? So remember, when we're strictly just displaying, we can just use the void return type because we're not returning anything, right? So let's just display info. What type of info? We're just going to display name, surname, and let us just return, let us display whether this person is a student or not, right? So we can have a boolean function is student, right? So that's essentially what we're going to display. Right. So now that we have that set up, right, we know that we created a function called display, right? It is expecting 3 parameters, right? So we need to ensure that we pass in those parameters, right? So what I like about Visual Studio Code, right, but I think this is something that we need to also know, right? We don't need Visual Studio Code to tell us, right? So we can see that that's really thingy, right? The red thingy. It's basically highlighting, it's saying too few arguments in a function call, right? Essentially, we're calling this function, right, and we're not passing in the enough parameters, right? Even in this case, we're not passing anything whatsoever, right? So it's expecting a string, it's expecting a string, and it's expecting a boolean, right? So we need to pass in that information, right? So this is how we're going to pass in the information, right? And for the last one, remember a boolean can only be true or false, right? So when this call is made, we can try and compile it, and we'll see that it will display the right information, right, as expected. Right, let's just go ahead and compile. Right, as we can see, I just missed some space, but yeah, we can see that I displayed the name, the surname, and the result, which is true. One is true, right? So let me just go ahead and put some space between the two, right, so we can see it better next time, right? So how default values work is that if we don't pass in a value, right, what we can do is have a default value. So let's just suppose that if this person does not pass in anything, we're going to assume that they're not a student, right? We're going to just assume that they're not a student. So let's have another call, right? In this call, what we're going to do is we're not going to pass in the last information. You see how it does not highlight any errors, and you'll see even when we compile, we won't run into any errors, because if we don't pass in the last parameter, right, it's essentially going to be false by default, right? So let us just see how that works. Just go ahead and clear this and compile. Remember, you need to compile after every change, right? Right. So we can see that by default is going to be false, right? This person is not a student, right? So the rules with default values, right, is that to the right of a default value, right? So when I say to the right of a default value, right, to the right of a default value, we cannot have a normal parameter, right? So when we say a normal parameter, we're referring to these type of parameters with no default values, right? So to the right of a default value, we cannot have a parameter. That means we cannot go ahead and do this and say by default, right, say someone's name, if they don't pass it in, it's going to be guessed, right? I want to show you what happens when when we do that, right? So we can already see before we even compile, Visual Studio Code is telling us that there's an error in this function call. It says too few arguments. Let me just find that error. Too few arguments in a function call. What's happening is that the order matters. What it's doing is that it's going to take this value, put it to the name, take this value, put it to the surname, right? And then here, which means we have no value. So the program essentially does not know what to do, right? That is why we cannot do that, right? That's why I say to the right of a default value, we cannot have a normal parameter, right? But if we went ahead and did this, then you will see that we will not have a problem. I don't know why Visual Studio is taking time, but yeah, we see that we don't have a problem now, right? Because it's just going to assign the values to the parameters, and then if there's no value for that parameter, it's just going to be the default value, right? So what key takeaway from this is that to the right of a default value, we cannot have a normal parameter. And what are considered normal parameters? These are not are considered normal parameters, right? Right. So we have reached the end of this episode. If this episode was helpful, you can go ahead and leave a like. Um, Subscribe if you want to stay tuned to new releases. Otherwise, cheers.